I'm
opening the seventh session of the trial. The Attorney General is requested to continue. I'm going to continue at the place where I stopped at the fourth chapter, the final solution of the Jewish question. On one occasion, the Foreign Ministry was not satisfied with the negative reply of Eichmann's deputy Günther and applied to him personally in the case of Andreas Michaelis, who was married to a Swiss citizen. The Foreign Ministry stated that for urgent political reasons, the request to save the Jew should be granted in view of the importance attached in his district to the woman's father because of his favorable attitude to Germany. Eichmann's personal answer was, I quote, "After re-examining the matter, I regretfully find that because of considerations of principle, I'm unable to permit the stateless Jew Michaelis to leave for Switzerland. We shall present to the court many such examples. We shall prove that he dealt with both the community and the individual, with every concentration of Jews and every individual Jew with whom he came to be concerned, and always with one goal, death." When the Germans sought a man to serve as French Commissar for Jewish Affairs in Laval's government, Eichmann was asked about the candidacy of Dupaty de Clan. Eichmann's office answered that the man seemed to him most suitable for the job, since his father was the French officer who had once arrested Dreyfus. The Swedish Foreign Ministry sought to save 30 Norwegian Jews born in Sweden by granting them Swedish citizenship. They too are human, those unfortunates, the representative of the Swedish embassy in Oslo explained to the Gestapo. Eichmann's answer was, I quote, "These efforts should be frustrated, and I intend to intern those Jews as soon as possible and without taking into consideration the framework of general Jewish activities." When he learned that a Swiss priest had published a book containing accounts of the fate of the Jews in the French deportation camps, he issued instructions that priests should henceforth be kept away from them. We shall show in this trial how much attention and care Eichmann devoted to closing every breach through which it might have been possible for any single Jew to slip through the net. Typical was his handling of an urgent application of the Foreign Office on May the 26th, 1943, with reference to Marius, a son of Zagreb, married to a Christian German woman, with 3 brothers serving in the German army on the Eastern Front, who had been sent to Auschwitz. In view of the desperate situation of the woman, Eichmann was asked to transfer Sasson to Germany and enable him to be reunited with his family. Eichmann delayed his answer a long while, until his office was in a position to reply that Sasson was no longer alive. When his envoy in France, Dannecker, encountered difficulties in getting trains for a transport to Auschwitz, a personal application of Eichmann was enough to get the matter arranged. In 1944, what was being done to the Jews in the area of German rule was already known in Europe. A number of Jews imprisoned in the Westbork camp in Holland intended for transport to Auschwitz, had received, through the efforts of relatives and friends in Switzerland, passports of Honduras, Peru, San Salvador, and other countries, which gave them the right to leave Europe. On the order of the accused, these passports were held up, but the question remained how to explain to the Swiss authorities the fact that registered letters sent from that country had not reached their destinations. The Swiss Post even demanded compensation. The accused issued an order. The German Post will notify the Swiss Post that the letters were lost because of enemy action. The letters should not be returned, and no compensation should be paid for their loss. At times we shall see the accused and his section even stepping out of the framework of strict camouflage and speaking frankly about the extermination, at least to the extent of internal exchanges within government circles. To the Assistant Director General of the Foreign Ministry, Luther, who had drawn his attention to complaints received about steps taken against Jews, the office of the accused wrote in answer, quote, "Where wood is being chopped, splinters will fall. The enemy will always try to exaggerate the measures used against him in order simply to awaken pity and with the hope that they will be discontinued. Ever since we have begun to intensify our measures against the Jewish enemy, he has been trying by means of anonymous letters to practically all institutions of the Reich to escape the fate he deserves." Unquote. It is hardly necessary to mention that this Jewish enemy was a defenseless civil population, including infants, children, women, and old men. We shall see, and the fate in store for them was murder. We shall see how Eichmann contended with the German diplomats themselves and with various authorities in the occupied zones who did not cooperate or do everything he wanted. We shall see his anger at Italian officials who on many occasions frustrated his plans. His wrath at the fact that Denmark, through a noble and dangerous operation, had smuggled her Jews to Sweden. His struggles with all the governments of the occupied countries to make them cooperate in his work. When the Pope himself interceded for the Jews of Rome, who were arrested practically underneath the Vatican window, who had been ordered to deny their origins and pretend to be Christians, who saw their fathers being lashed with whips before their eyes, in front of whom discussions would be carried on by the German institutions as to who should be killed first, the father or the son, who went to the open grave with "Hear, O Israel," on their lips. These children and youths, who despite all the desperate measures and concealments would finally fall into the hands of their hunters, they are the very soul and innermost core of the indictment. Those Anne Franks and Justine Drangers and a million others, those unplumbed treasures of radiant youth and hope for life and achievement, they were the future of the Jewish people. He that destroyed them was seeking to destroy the Jewish people. We shall present the pictures of some of those children, swollen with hunger, frightened and crushed, with eyes frozen with terror. We shall show you the photographs of their starved bodies thrown into manure wagons. of the helpless little ones on the thresholds of the extermination chambers. Perhaps we shall succeed in painting a pale and inadequate picture of the calamity wide as the ocean that overtook the house of Israel.
It is no wonder that the German Foreign Ministry passed on for Eichmann's information the warning broadcast by London radio that those responsible for the murders in Auschwitz would be brought to judgment. Even on the verge of the German collapse in April 1945, in that atmosphere of the twilight of the gods, when the Allies from the east and west and south were closing in, Eichmann still told the German Red Cross man that he could not agree to the more humanitarian methods of dealing with Jews then being considered by Himmler. Is it any wonder then that one of those days he said to a close assistant that he would be ready to commit suicide and that he would gladly leap into his grave after he had succeeded in exterminating 5 million Jews? In this too he may be followed in the footsteps of his master Hitler, who also said that he would die happy with the knowledge of Germany's great achievements and her contribution to history. Many millions of non-Jews also perished in the Great War. We shall not attempt to decide here at this trial which of the acts of hostility were permissible and which were forbidden by the rules of war laid down by international law. But we shall say with all the emphasis at our command that the extermination of the Jewish people was not connected with any military action. It cannot be compared with the bombing of cities, submarine warfare, or the like. These were acts of war, and whether they were legitimate or not, a question which we shall not attempt to decide here, they were carried out in connection with and in the process of waging war. The extermination of the Jews had no connection with the war effort of Germany and her allies. The extermination was carried out at the time of the war, when the battle smoke to some extent covered and concealed the atrocities. But it was not done in pursuit of war, nor was it impelled by war needs. This was a separate and special action in itself which could be implemented more easily, more conveniently, with less intervention from internal or external elements during the war, since it was then possible to camouflage what was done behind the cover of the war effort. Indeed, even in the Nazi documents dealing with the extermination of the Jews and explaining the decision to take this action, we shall nowhere find it stated that the thing was being done in order to advance military operations. Quite the contrary. If there were some Nazi leaders or their henchmen who wanted to postpone the final solution for a while, they did so on the ground of the need to exploit Jewish labor power in wartime. We shall present proofs of this contention, and at this stage I shall mention one piece of evidence. When the German army invaded the Soviet Union, instructions were given for the immediate destruction of the Jews by the special mission groups. We shall see later in the sequel how these orders were carried out. In report number 81 of the Einsatzgruppen, dated September 12, 1941, we read the following. Quote, one should note as an exceptional phenomenon the discovery of Jewish kolchozes, collective farms. Between Krivoy Rog and Dnepropetrovsk there are Jewish kolchozes in which not only the directors but also all the labor power is Jewish. These are, as far as we can see, not very intelligent Jews, who have therefore been transferred by the political leadership to farm labor. Einsatz Commando 6 has decided, in this case, not to shoot these Jews in order to enable them to continue working. And they contented themselves with liquidating the Jewish management and replacing it with a Ukrainian one. Unquote. We see that for the sake of the war effort, the Special Mission Group departed from their orders and left a few Jews alive. But this is not all. Means of transport were of decisive importance to the German war effort, especially when the fronts expanded in the east, south, and west. When the army needed every locomotive and railway car, and there was a severe shortage of transport, trains were still found for shipments to the extermination centers. While the front was crying out for manpower, the units needed for the work of annihilation were found. The extermination program was to have been kept secret for a variety of reasons. First, in order to delude the victims themselves and make them believe that they were merely being brought to labor camps. We shall see later how many ingenious devices the Nazis used to camouflage the gas vans as dwelling places, to erect a sham railway station in Treblinka so that it would seem to be merely a transit point. And even at the gates of Auschwitz they inscribed, Arbeit macht frei, that is, labor liberates. To facilitate the camouflage, the prisoners in the camps were ordered to write postcards to their relatives saying that they were well, and the postcards would arrive after their writers had long been consumed by the flames. But the device, of course, served the purpose of momentarily allaying apprehensions, fostering illusions, and dampening the will to rebel, since it seemed to indicate that the deportees were still alive and that the horrible stories about extermination were perhaps not true. Secondly, the camouflage was needed to hide what was happening from the eyes of the world. That was why the Führer commanded that everything relating to these activities be kept a strict secret, that no one should know more than what he had to know to do his job, and that the necessary instructions should be transmitted only very close to the actual implementation. The German military command ordered that the expression transportation to France forced labor should be used instead of transfer to the east or deportation. In the Gestapo itself, an atmosphere of secrecy and camouflage prevailed. But the secret, of course, could not be kept inviolate very long, especially after the circle of conspirators, the planners, executors, and others concerned widened as the circles of extermination spread ever wider. Not only did the thousands in the Einsatzgruppen know about it, but also the letter carriers who had to return mail stamped address unknown, the clerks in the registration offices who had to cross the deportees' names off their books, and the thousands of soldiers on leave from all the fronts, so that finally, one way or another, the knowledge reached many millions of the German people. From Eichmann himself we shall hear that at first there were instructions to use camouflage, Tarnung, and that the fact of extermination was kept a strict state secret. I know only, he says, that towards the end, during 43, 44, and 45, to use a somewhat exaggerated expression, the sparrows were already chirping this from the rooftops. In a long speech of encouragement and praise delivered by Himmler to SS officers in Poznan on October 4th, 1943, while expressing approval and commendation for the courage strength of character, and other precious attributes of his men, he said, quotes, "Here I shall speak with complete frankness about an especially difficult chapter. Among ourselves, let us for once be quite frank, but in public we shall never speak of it. I mean the evacuation of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish people. It's easy to say. Most of you will know what it means to have 100 corpses lying together, 500 corpses lying together, or 1,000 corpses lying together. To live through all this and at the same time remain decent. And that made us hard. That is a noteworthy page in our history, which has never been written and which will never be written." Unquote. It was in such episodes as these that a German leader saw the greatness of his people. Yet it was something to be kept hidden and secret. Since then the matter has been revealed. What those villains regarded with pride is now their badge of eternal shame. And what they did in concealment, in the hope that the greatest murder in history would remain strictly secret, all this will be told here openly, will be revealed and branded in the light of day.
And now, let us trace the bloody work of Adolf Eichmann in the various countries through which the Nazi rule passed like a rod of wrath. Poland was the first country to savor the bitter taste of the German blitzkrieg, when 1.5 million soldiers, armed with a range of destructive weapons, protected by a gigantic umbrella of fighter planes and equipped with all modern instruments of communication, swept into the country at the outbreak of World War II. Poland had always been especially hated by the Nazis. It was the offspring of the Versailles Peace Treaty, which they regarded as an insult to the German people. It separated East and West Prussia, and it controlled Danzig. These facts were featured in the campaign of incitement conducted by the Nazis while they were fighting for power, against the idea that Germany might accept the consequences of a defeat in World War I. After coming to power, Hitler succeeded in misleading the Polish statesmen of the day, who fell unsuspectingly into his trap. As far back as 1934, he managed to drive a wedge between Poland and France by enticing the Poles to sign a non-aggression treaty, and while he was busy making conquests without war in other places, he led them to believe that he sought peace. This situation did not last long, however, and the Teutonic fury was directed against Poland in the lightning invasion of September the 1st, 1939. Nazi race doctrine regarded the Slav peoples as inferior beings whose historic destiny it was to serve higher and nobler peoples. It was therefore the declared aim of Nazi policy to subjugate the Polish people and never to allow it to recover. Thus, after the conquest, Hitler told Frank, the Reich Governor-General of Poland, I quote, "The Government-General will serve only as a reservoir of manual labor. Workers required by the Reich will be brought from the Government-General. There will be only one master for the Poles, the Germans, and therefore all the representatives of the Polish intelligentsia are to be destroyed. We shall see to it that the Poles do not die of hunger and so forth, but they must not reach any higher level. If once the Poles reach a higher level of development, they will cease to be the manpower reservoir which we need. The humblest German worker or farmer must always be at least 10% higher than any Pole. Unquote. If this was the attitude of the Germans to the dominant part of the population, their attitude to the Jews of Poland was immeasurably worse. They were simply abandoned to their fate. Insofar as there were any divisions of opinion between the government general and the Rizha on the attitude to be adopted towards the Polish Jews, they related solely to the choice of the appropriate date for their extermination. While Frank tried to carry out his mission as governor of the corridor to the Reich by supplying labor, manufacturing ammunition, food and other commodities, and destroying the Jews only after they had contributed their sweat and manpower to German industry, orders came from Berlin to exterminate them, and besides, the Gestapo machine acted on its own responsibility without coordination with or regard for the government general. This aroused Frank's anger to fever pitch. We have in our possession Frank's diary, which contains minutes of meetings of his administration and notes from his speeches. I shall quote a few extracts from this document. At a meeting held on December 9, 1942, Frank complained that the Jewish labor force was being taken away from him. And I quote, "It is obvious that they are making our work very difficult. If in the middle of this war work an order comes to send all Jews to extermination, but this order comes from above. The order to exterminate Jews comes from higher levels. Taking the Jews away has caused immense difficulties in the labor field. Now the order comes to take the Jews out of the munitions factories." Unquote. Let us not delude ourselves that Frank wanted to save the Jews from their doom. A year earlier, he had said at a meeting of his government, "As far as the Jews are concerned, this I want to say openly. They must be finished off in one way or another. There is criticism of many measures at present being employed in the Reich against the Jews. There is talk of atrocities, brutalities, etc. I must ask you first to agree with me before I go any further on one formula. We shall have sympathy for the German people alone, and not for anyone else in the world. As a veteran National Socialist, I have to say that if the Jewish community in Europe survives the war after we have sacrificed our dearest blood to hold Europe, then we shall have achieved only partial success in this war. I have therefore basically only one expectation of the Jews, that they shall disappear." Unquote. There were, however, differences of opinion as to the method of their disappearance. From time to time, Frank asked the Gestapo to leave him at least the skilled workers and not to send them off to be killed. But generally, the Gestapo paid no attention to his requests, and the accused and his accomplices went ahead with the destruction of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. Frank complained bitterly that the Gestapo was acting independently in the area under his rule and creating a state within a state. "We have established in the Reich a plethora of authorities which are actively engaged in warring one against the other." Quarrel reached the point where Frank submitted his resignation on May 1943, but Hitler did not accept it. By then, the greater part of Polish Jewry had been destroyed, and internal Nazi power struggles brought no deliverance whatsoever to the Jews. And when the ashes of the last of the Polish Jews were heaped up in the sandhills of Auschwitz, Frank said, I quote, "We started here with 3.5 million Jews, of whom only a few labor companies are left. All the rest have, let us say, emigrated." Unquote. The minutes add that amongst those present there was a general atmosphere of joy at hearing this description of the extermination process. The extermination of the Jews was not the work of Frank. We have already heard Bühler, the head of his government, announcing at the Wannsee conference that this matter belonged to the Rizha, namely to the accused. Nor were the death camps under Frank's control, and this too was stated explicitly at those meetings. Quote, "These camps were set up directly by the SS from Berlin, whence they were administered, and for everything which takes place in those camps, the center in Berlin is responsible." Unquote. So in fact it was, and we shall receive evidence of this from others also. In Poland, Jewish suffering began with the entry of the German army. Pogroms, brutality, degradation, the burning of synagogues, the plunder of property, collective fines, all these immediately became the lot of the Jews in occupied Poland. Thousands fell victim in the very first weeks and were killed in a variety of ways. The Jews of Yaroslav were brought to the banks of the river San and drowned in their hundreds, and the Jews of Bydgoszcz, Bromberg, were butchered. In Lodz, a pogrom was held in honor of Goebbels' visit. Atrocities against the Jews were the order of the day. Their beards were forcibly torn out with the skins. Synagogues were set on fire, and often, as in Wlocławek, the Jewish leaders were arrested and forced to sign a declaration that they had been the incendiaries. In fact, on the basis of this declaration, the Jews of the city were fined 100,000 zlotys on account of the fire. In the space of a few weeks, hundreds of synagogues were burned down, blown up, or converted into prisons and public lavatories. The Jews were ordered to clean the streets with their prayer shawls, to burn holy books, and to dance around the bonfires. All these spectacles being photographed for publication in the Stürmer and other Nazi newspapers. Simultaneously, the Nazis began the systematic plunder of Jewish property by various methods, including collective fines, confiscation of houses and their contents, and at times straightforward theft on the pretext of searching for weapons. Jews were kidnapped and carried off for forced labor. Passers-by were seized in the streets. A man would go out in the morning and not know whether he would come home in the evening. Some would return with labor cards in their possession. Others did not return at all. The Germans explained that they had been sent off to work outside the city, and they were never seen again. SS men would burst into the ghettos and with blows force the Jews to come out and perform duties designed to degrade them, digging open pits and then closing them up, moving mounds of stones and putting them back again, and the like. The Jews were transformed into a herd of terrified, degraded and depressed beings, lacking all human rights. Their synagogues were closed, their public life came to a standstill, their sources of livelihood dwindled. This, however, was for the time being the period of minor terror. The tragedy and destruction of Polish Jewry was yet to come. Heydrich's instructions of September 21, 1939 with regard to the treatment of the Jews have already been mentioned in connection with the planning of the Holocaust. The first part of these instructions, given in cooperation with the accused to Einsatzgruppen, involved the identification and concentration of the Jews as intermediate steps towards the final solution. This concentration was not very difficult to carry out in Poland, as the majority of the Jewish population in any case lived in cities and townlets. It was immediately ordered that every Jew must wear the Jewish badge, and anyone who violated the instruction was put to death. Hitler, Goering and Keitel issued orders on October 7, 1939 for the establishment of settled areas for Germans in the east, from which other ethnic groups were to be removed. Himmler was given almost unlimited powers. The implementation of this program devolved on the security police, whose chief, Heydrich, gave the following order on December 12, 1939. Important reasons make the central handling of all police and security matters connected with the execution of the evacuation in the eastern areas necessary. I have therefore appointed SS Hauptsturmführer Eichmann, deputizing for SS Hauptsturmführer Günther, as my special representative in the Reichssicherheitshauptamt Bureau 4. Unquote. The objectives of this action were defined in a detailed document describing the aims of German policy in the areas of Poland annexed to the Reich. These aims included the deportation of all the populations which could not be restored to the bosom of the German people by a process of Germanization, and the resettlement of the whole area by Germans. The Jews were to be deported as swiftly as possible and all their rights cancelled. The task of making the detailed plans and carrying out the deportations devolved upon the accused, Eichmann. It was also thenceforth his function, inter alia, to carry out Himmler's orders for the deportation of all the Jews from what was called the Ostraum. From then on, Eichmann operated in the East in the name of the Reichsführer himself and with his authority.
In September 1939, orders were also carried out with regard to organized plunder of Jewish property, confiscation of their factories and warehouses, and after that pillage of whatever came to hand. In addition, they began to impose financial levies on the Jewish communities, simply according to whim. In October 1939, an Eastern Trustee Authority, Treuhandstelle Ost, was set up to handle the plundered property, with a head office in Berlin and branches in a number of the leading Polish cities. Himmler issued regulations for cooperation with this authority, which was given unlimited rights to confiscate Polish and Jewish property. In January 1940, we already find a representative of the Treuhandstelle Ost present at a meeting to deal with the deportations, presided over by Eichmann. At this meeting there was a discussion on the methods used so far to carry out the deportations to the area of the Government General, and it was reported that in one transport 100 men had frozen to death. It was decided that at an early date about 350,000 Jews would be deported from the Vartagau area, which included Lodz and Poznan, to the military government area in coordination with Frank's government. The only property that a Jew would be allowed to take with him would be 100 Polish zlotys. Reports on each transport were to be submitted to police headquarters in Krakow and to Adolf Eichmann. At a meeting of the administration of the Government General, this movement was described as a modern migration of peoples. And 2 years later, Frank was to describe this operation as follows, quotes, "Then came the fantastic transfer of hundreds of thousands of Jews and Poles to the Government General. You will recall the terrible months during which freight trains fully loaded with people rolled in day by day. There were trucks filled to overflowing with corpses. This was a terrible time when every district chief, every local and municipal officer had to chase around from morning to night to get rid of this influx of these elements who had become unwanted in the Reich and whom they had suddenly decided to shift. All this we had to endure." Unquote. What the victims of that dreadful journey had to endure, what suffering and torment, how they fell by the wayside with their little ones, how they dragged through the mud and snow, of all this, of course, Frank had nothing to say. This deportation encompassed about 500,000 people and was carried out by a special RHSA Department 4D4, headed by Adolf Eichmann. Included also in this deportation program were the Jews of East Prussia. Finally, in view of Frank's protest that the transports gave him and his assistants too heavy a load of work, Goering ordered on March 23, 1940, that there should be no more deportations to the area of the Government General without Frank's prior consent. In the meantime, the concentration of the Jews in Poland and the plunder of their property continued in accordance with the Master Plan of 1939. Ghettos were established in the worst districts of the cities, where it was quite impossible to maintain hygiene. The inhuman overcrowding and filth soon produced severe epidemics. To leave the ghetto meant public execution. The ghetto itself became an instrument of extermination. Let us listen to an authentic description. Quote, "On Yom Kippur 1940, the radio announced the German order for the setting up of a Jewish quarter in the city of Warsaw. Within a few days, the Jews had to leave their homes outside and to enter the quarter without being told into which part they were to go. Thus about 100,000 Jews entered the Jewish quarter, which was already overcrowded. They became refugees, carrying their worldly goods by hand or on a cart, wandering through the streets, stopping at a house, standing confused, not knowing where to go. At that time, the ghetto was still open, and there was contact with the outside world. It was still possible to go to work outside the Jewish quarter. After a short while, and without previous notice, the Jewish quarter was isolated and walled off, and German or Polish police stationed at every gate or exit. All at once, the ghetto was cut off from its sources of livelihood, from places of work, and from all possibility of obtaining essential commodities, and its inhabitants felt that prison walls had closed in upon them. During that period, tens of thousands of Jews were brought into the Warsaw Ghetto from nearby provincial towns. These people were ordered to wind up their affairs at 2 hours' notice, take with them what they could carry in their hands and on their backs, and they were all brought on foot into the Warsaw Ghetto. Generally, anyone who faltered or stumbled and stopped for a moment with a groan was shot dead. Once again, a stream of refugees came into the ghetto. Once again, people were seen standing or sitting in the ghetto streets without roof or food, waiting for salvation. Life in this ghetto became an unbearable hell. There was frightful overcrowding with tens of people to a room. The sanitary conditions were appalling, which led to epidemics and disease. Since it was impossible to find work except in the German slave enterprises or to obtain food, starvation soon followed. Entire Jewish families, men, women and children, could be seen sitting on the pavements, swollen with hunger. During the curfew hours, when it was quiet in the streets, the voices of little children could be heard on all sides, begging for a piece of bread, a shtickel brot. But all they could get were a few crumbs from Jews who had pity upon them. In the morning, corpses, especially of children, were found on the pavements near the gates, covered with paper, for during the night even their clothing had been taken. Of course, the most difficult plight was that of the refugees who had come in from the neighboring towns, as it was impossible to find any unoccupied space for them within the ghetto, and they were packed into refugee houses. In these it was impossible to pass. There was not an inch of space unoccupied. Their food consisted only of a plate of soup and a piece of bread per day. Every day, hundreds of Jews were buried. Every morning, those Jews assigned to the factories set up by the Germans ran out to work, hoping thus to save their lives. Many never managed to reach the workshops, because the Germans would enter the ghetto, take up positions in the middle of the street, and begin to shoot. The Jews did not know where the danger points were and generally gathered together in one place. Then the SS men would close off the streets, collect the Jews together in one place, and take them off to an Umschlag, a deportation point, always on the pretext of examining labor cards. They would release a few people because of their work. There were heart-rending scenes. They would catch a Jew who had a labor card, but take his children away from him, while he pleaded for permission to go with his children, but to no avail. They would provide carts for the old and the sick, and these people could be seen with their pitiful bundles traveling through the streets on their last journey. At the same time, the terror within the ghetto did not cease during the whole period of the deportations. Using resistance as an excuse, they would kill scores of Jews as an example to others. There were SS men who caught little children and smashed their heads on the paving stones. In many cases it seemed that apart from the deportations, Germans were treating Jews with brutality simply for the pleasure of doing so. As the famine grew worse, the SS men developed a new method. They announced that volunteers for deportation would receive 3 kilograms of bread and a kilogram of jam for the journey, and indeed many were compelled by the insupportable pangs of hunger to present themselves at the deportation point. Again, convoys of Jews were seen moving towards the Umschlag, carrying their goods and their children. unquote. One of the first ghettos was set up in Lodz, Litzmannstadt, where 160,000 persons were crowded together in an area of 4 square kilometers. People lived 6 to a room. In the first year and a quarter, about 15,000 of them died. In spite of the terrible conditions, Eichmann pushed into the city another 20,000 Jews and 5,000 gypsies from the Reich. The district commissioner complained to Himmler himself that Eichmann had apparently given incorrect facts with regard to the capacity of the ghetto, which was being swept by epidemics. He compared Eichmann's methods with those of gypsies at a horse market. When he wrote this on October 9th, 1941, he did not know that a decision had already been taken to exterminate all the Jews, and it did not matter by what methods this end would be achieved.
In the fateful summer of 1941, ideas and plans for the extermination of the Jews were being mooted in Germany. Eichmann's representative in Poznan, Sturmbannführer Heppner, wrote a personal letter to the accused, in which inter alia he suggested that all the Jews from the Warthegau area, about 300,000 in number, should be concentrated in a place where they could work in the coal mines. He thought that in this way he would overcome the danger of epidemics that existed in Lodz and other ghettos, and also get control of the problem. In this camp, all the Jewish women would be sterilized so as to finish off the Jewish problem in this generation. He added, and I quote, "There is a danger that this winter we shall be unable to feed all the Jews. It is worth considering seriously whether it would not be the most humane solution to finish off the Jews, insofar as they are not fit for work, by some quicker method. At all events, this would be more pleasant than to let them die of hunger." Unquote. In the accompanying letter, Heppner writes that possibly his proposals seemed fantastic, but they were practicable. Apparently, he did not know the degree to which plans of this kind had been prepared for implementation as part of the general solution. In the summer of 1943, Eichmann came to the Lodz ghetto, and there, after consultation with those concerned, the conclusion was reached that the ghetto was no longer worth maintaining. It was therefore decided that it should be turned into a concentration camp in which only persons fit for work would be left. The others would be sent off. Another method used by the Gestapo to liquidate Polish Jewry was that of the labor camps. As early as the second month after the conquest, all Polish Jews between the ages of 14 and 60 were told to register for work. They were ordered to carry out the most difficult assignments under a regime of blows and severe physical punishment. In these camps, men began to collapse because the effort demanded of them exceeded human strength. According to the report of the Polish Government Committee for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in Poland, there were more than 300 such labor camps. The prisoners built roads, set up fortifications, diverted streams, and worked in factories, quarries, and so forth. In the ghettos also, labor duty was the general rule. Evidence will be brought as to living conditions in such a camp. In Plaszów, near Krakow, the day's work started at 4 a.m. and finished late at night. The living quarters consisted of huts, in each of which several hundred people slept in three-tiered bunks. Work was carried out continually on the run. Those who fell behind received 25 strokes on their bare bodies. For food, there was a little bread, twice a day a drink that was called coffee, a weak soup at midday, and at times a little fat. The inmates were always hungry, but it was forbidden to bring food in from outside, and violators of this rule were shot or hanged. At times a whole group would be punished for this offense. Very often mass beatings would be carried out on the parade ground.